Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, Digital Accessibility in the IoT Era, Moving Beyond Pure Compliance. I'm Alexandra Barcelona and I'll be today's moderator. I'd like to start with a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent out after to everyone who registered. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end, so please submit your questions in the panel on your screen. For today's agenda, we'll start with our introductions. We'll go through digital ambition, the era of digital, winning with digital, and bridging the digital divide. Then we'll dive into what is web accessibility, differentiating with accessibility, the intersection of accessibility and user experience, and finally, emerging interfaces and accessibility, followed with our Q&A session. Today's speakers, we have Stefan Schinkel, Enterprise Sales at dotCMS, and Everett Zufelt, Director of Technology at Myplanet. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Stefan.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, folks. Thanks for joining us today in this webinar about digital accessibility. But before we go into the details, I'd like to take one step back and talk about your digital ambition, right? So again, based on research by Gartner, the majority of you guys are executing on your digital ambition, right? Whether it's optimizing the business or transforming or doing both, right? And some of you might even have no ambition at all. Regardless, digital is really a key enabler, right? To really drive operational excellence, create new business models, as well as products and services, and generate new revenue stream is hugely important. And digital is your tool. Winning in digital or with digital also puts you in a position to differentiate yourself from your competition. Focus on experience and hyper-personalization are definitely your go-to tactics. Again, this is nothing new. It's based on research in 2016 by Accenture and the World Economic Forum. So definitely, great tactics to differentiate yourself. Right now, that all sounds familiar and great. So really nothing new. But I do see, particularly in the context of digital accessibility, some challenges, right? And yesterday I stumbled upon these data points. It was part of a research conducted by Binder. Binder is a digital asset management vendor, so they're really focused on creating visual content, right? So the second data point was kind of interesting. 66% of marketers or decision makers want to invest more in branded visual content, right, compared to 2018. The other data point, like 50%, not really confident about personalization or deliver a personalized consumer experience. I thought that was interesting too. Not really surprising because we're, serving and drinking this Kool-Aid for 10 years now, and I still see, experience maturity with our customers and prospects is definitely, relatively low, so to say. But again, I thought the second data point was interesting, along with this data point, right? So in the US, disabled Americans are 3 times less likely to go online, right? So we can talk about digital transformation and what have you and have that ambition. If disabled Americans are 3 times less likely to go online, you will not reach them, right? So that's a challenge, obviously, right? Because experience probably looks a little bit like this, right? So that's not good. Other drivers to get digital accessibility right is obviously the law. Some other interesting data points I'd like to share here is the number of lawsuits in the U.S. in 2018 compared to 2017. showed a staggering 181% increase in 2018 over 2017, and that number will definitely rise. And I also thought the industries that received the biggest focus in those litigation include, basically any industry, right? So from retail to travel and hospitality, entertainment, leisure, banking, food service industry, etc. So it's definitely everywhere. So, but still, this should not be your biggest driver to get digital accessibility right in the execution of your digital ambition. Um, Again, some great research by Accenture. Interesting data point that people with disabilities can potentially add 23 billion to the global economy. Right, so this is at a global scale. I thought this number was already pretty significant, right? And of course, there's people with disabilities already in our workforce and contributing to local and global economy, but this is the unleashed potential. So that's a great number, but it is by far not as big as the number that I really wanted to share with you, and which should be, in my opinion, your number one criteria to get digital accessibility right, and that's the staggering $8 trillion of disposable income that people with disabilities basically control, right? And so that's a huge number. I mean, last time that I checked my bank account, I didn't come even close to a fraction of that, right? So this is huge, right? This is money that they want to spend, regardless of where you are and which industry. This is huge, and this is a growing, or actually, it's one of the fastest growing minority groups according to the UN, and with the aging population, this only gets bigger, right? So, yeah, this should really be your key driver to include digital accessibility in the execution of your digital ambition. Now, before I hand over to Everett, there was one final statement I would like to make. It's really talking about dotCMS and how we fit into that, the execution of your digital ambition, and definitely inclusive of digital accessibility, really delivering that content foundation as a service that allows you to create and build that digital experience platform to really deliver those digital experiences, right? Along with getting digital accessibility right, and we do that by offering a cloud-ready platform that is decoupled, is open for interoperability, as well as aiming for the highest level of no-code in the industry, right? So I wanted to share that with you, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Everett. Everett, take it away.
Thanks, Alex and Stefan, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here talking about digital accessibility. I want to take a few moments just to introduce myself and let you all know why I'm so passionate about this work and the partnership that we've had with Myplanet. My name's Everett Zufelt. I'm the Director of Technology Services at Myplanet. And we're a software studio in Toronto, and we're really looking to change the nature of how we engage together at work through using emerging interfaces, artificial intelligence, and we really want to make sure that in all the work we do, we're ensuring that that work is accessible to the broadest possible audience. About myself, I live in Toronto. I started working at Myplanet about 7 years ago, and I really spent a lot of time on the road with our customers and meeting with our teams to see how we can build smarter interfaces using emerging technology. I was born with a degenerative eye disease. I was able to see for about the first 20 or 25 years of my life, but gradually I experienced vision loss, and at this point in time, I'm completely blind. I interact on the web and with email, with digital devices, using a couple of different screen readers. And a screen reader is a piece of technology that takes the information that's on the screen and digitizes it. Sometimes, and the way I use it is it turns it into a synthetic voice so I can listen to my emails and I can listen to the content on a web page. Other people use a braille display with a screen reader. So in that scenario, the information is turned into raised dots that they read with their fingers like they would with any sort of printed braille. I live the experience of accessibility every day, and sometimes, and certainly feel free to reach out afterward, but sometimes I offer what I call is a little bit of a private shaming, where I can help you, from my perspective, understand what barriers or frustrations may be created through your product for the consumers that are interacting with it. I want to take a moment just to touch on the topics that we're going to be speaking about today, and then we'll dive right in. So the first thing I want to do, I'm sure that those of you who've joined the discussion today come with a variety of different backgrounds and levels of exposure to what web accessibility is. So I really want to do a quick overview of some different concepts and principles around web accessibility. But then I'm going to talk about what it means for you and your business, about how you can differentiate with accessibility. More broadly, why should this be important to you? I want to look at where user experience intersects with accessibility. Some of the resistance that I've seen in the past with organizations we've worked with is around user experience and design teams. I don't really think that there is any conflict between user experience and accessibility, and I actually want to go so far as to argue that great user experience is universally designed and accessible by default. And then finally, I want to share some really interesting new tools and emerging technologies that we want to make sure are being built in a way that is accessible, but B, that helps you to broaden the reach of your content and ensuring that it can be used by the broadest possible audience. So imagine, I want to maybe help you build a little bit of an understanding, if you don't have one already, of who and how your application's accessibility may impact people. So imagine, if you will, that your friends have referred you to this great new social media platform. You're excited, everybody you know is on there. You try to go and register, and you find that it's impossible. Maybe you face one of those scrambled number letter challenges. Maybe you're listening to some garbled audio you have to type in. Maybe it's just as simple as no matter what you do, you can't find the box to type your email address on the page. It's certainly a barrier to collaboration and to being integrated fully in culture. Imagine if you're kind of surfing the web, you're thinking I want to buy something, you find the right website, you spend the time doing the research, you finally pick the perfect product, you get it into your cart, but no matter what you do on that checkout page, you can't find the checkout button. You find it, you click it, and it does nothing. You click it, and things just spin and spin and spin, and nothing happens. Incredibly frustrating, and certainly an opportunity for a brand to lose a potential customer. Imagine if you, at work, we use all these tools at work. Imagine if you were to log into an application for your job, maybe like me, rather than looking at the user interface, you hear what's happening on the user interface using voice. And when you're trying to find the button, the task that you need to complete, maybe it's requesting a day off, maybe it's sending an email or booking a flight. Imagine if all you hear is the word button, 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 with no real clear explanation of what the purpose of that button is, or to bring it into a visual modality. Imagine you're looking at the screen and you can see all sorts of buttons, but none of them have icons and none of them have labels. It creates a really frustrating experience, and it creates a barrier to be able to fully participate in the workforce. And one thing that I found is I use it as an example here because I do find that it is common. Imagine trying to book a flight, book a hotel room. Maybe it's a new hotel. You go, you try to book it, and no matter what you do, you click on that, you hit the enter key, you click in the date field. Nothing you do allows you to enter a date into the date field. So the examples can go on, but I hope that gives you a little bit of an example of the types of barriers people with disabilities face when interacting with digital technology. And certainly if they're your constituents, if they're your customers, if they're part of your online community, you want to be removing as many of those barriers as possible. There's some myths I'd like to dispel really up front around accessibility, because I think that there's a lot of things that are misunderstood. First of all, one myth: there aren't that many people with disabilities. There's quite a few people in the world with disabilities of one type or another, many of whom are your employees, many of whom are your customers, many of whom are members of your community. And it's important that we make sure that those disabilities are accommodated for in the digital interfaces we build. People with disabilities don't use my web application. Well, I'll tell you, if it's a hotel or if it's a flight or if it's buying groceries online, I use all those applications every day. If it's researching something for my family, researching something for work, education, I'm one example, but people with disabilities are fully integrated into society, and they're using your applications every day. Another myth is that perhaps we believe our web application is accessible. Maybe the organization or our internal development team told us that they built it accessibly and that we have nothing to worry about, but we've never actually tested it. We've never asked a user or a set of users with different disabilities to try to use it. We've never solicited feedback. We've never had an expert review. So I think that a lot of the time we can think that we're building something that's accessible, really find out after the fact that there were some major barriers in place that created frustration for our customers. And the last point here that I think is a myth we want to dispel right up front: accessibility is incredibly expensive, or I'll have to throw this whole thing out and start from scratch. Certainly there's a cost to accessibility. There's a cost to understanding and testing and where necessary, implementing improvements to an application. But I want to assure you, certainly there's no need to throw everything out and start from the beginning. Certainly if you are starting a project from the beginning, you're going to want to make sure that you bake accessibility and universal design of that application in from the upfront. But if you have something in market, maybe it's been released recently, maybe it's been in market for a couple of years, you don't have any intention to replace it, we can certainly work together to find ways to improve the accessibility. So I want to make sure that we level set here on really what are we talking about accessibility. We're talking about ensuring that persons with disabilities, whether it's motor function, visual, hearing loss, learning disabilities, or any other type of disability, whether it's permanent or temporary. Maybe you've broken your dominant hand and you're trying to use that mouse with the opposite hand. And if you've ever had that experience, you know how frustrating it can be, certainly in the beginning. But it goes away over time and you regain the ability to use your dominant hand. So temporary or permanent, regardless the nature of the disability, what we're talking about here is making sure that web applications, websites work and are, I'd go so far as to say are enjoyable experiences for people with different types of disabilities. Kind of going back to that myth that we talked about earlier, there's tons of people that have disabilities in the world. World Health Organization estimates about 15% of the world population has a disability. And somewhere around 2 to 4% of that is a severe disability. I'd say that yes, this is likely data that is skewed more toward underdeveloped and developing parts of the world, but certainly disability is prevalent in developed parts of the world as well. So it's a pretty significant amount if you think about it of your potential addressable market. If you think about it as the constituents of your organization, if you think about it as your employees, that's a pretty significant amount of the people who you're interacting with on a daily basis. We're going to want to make sure that our web applications and our websites are going to work nicely and smoothly for them all. I want to take a moment just to contextualize this a little bit further around a couple of personas. And we grabbed these from the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative. great work they've been doing for many years now, building up thought leadership and expertise guidance around ensuring that web applications are built in an accessible way. I just want to touch on a few personas. There's a number more that they provide on the site, just to help you understand who these people are and how they may be interacting. So Lee is an online shopper with color blindness. A lot of things we could learn about Lee, but if you think to yourself, I've been on some of those websites, and on them there's a form and there's this little note at the top of the form. You might not even read it, because if you can see and you don't have color blindness, it doesn't really impact you. But there's often a little note at the top of the form that says required fields are marked in red. Well, for people like myself who are fully blind, or for people like Lee, we might not be able to distinguish which fields are marked in red, and we don't actually know how properly to fill in your form. You could say that we could just fill in all of the fields on the form, and sometimes that's what I do. But if there's a lot of fields, or if I maybe don't want to give you all that information, we haven't built trust yet, I might actually just abandon filling in the form, hit the back button in my browser, and look for a different company to engage with. Alex is another person we want to talk to. Alex is a reporter with some repetitive stress injury, doesn't like to use a mouse, prefers to use the keyboard. And if we think about Alex, a great question I'd like you to think about, and maybe after the webinar go and try out, is, can you interact with your website using only a keyboard? So no touchscreen, no mouse, no pointing device on your Mac. Can you use a keyboard alone and fully navigate and fully interact with the different sections of your website? And if you can't, you've probably created a barrier for Alex and others like him. Martine's another example persona. Martine's hard of hearing. There's a lot of different barriers that Martine's going to face, but if we think about, more and more video is being pushed to the forefront. Video is a really engaging way to interact with customers. Nice short bursts on the homepage, testimonials, advocacy. But we're going to want to make sure that for Martine and others like Martine, there's some alternative to the audio that's in that video, so that there's going to be an ability to get the meaning out. And if we think about, for a moment, maybe not temporary or permanent disabilities, but if we start to think about some folks who might have situational disability, what if you're trying to read that on a loud streetcar? What if you're trying to engage and consume that information when you're in a noisy environment? And what you might prefer, even if you don't consider yourself to be a person with a disability, what you might prefer is the ability to just read the transcript or watch the caption rather than to listening to the audio. Ilya, like myself, is completely blind, has to interact with all sorts of digital tools every day. She's in a rather executive role in her organization. And again, if her screen reader isn't able to engage with your application and your content, she's going to be frustrated. She's going to probably walk away if she's a customer, and she's going to try to find another place that she can procure the same product or service. So there's guidelines to make this easier, and I'm not going to go over the guidelines today. I really just want to cover this at a very high level, but the World Wide Web Consortium, like I said earlier, has been doing great work on this for many, many years. Way back in 1999, they released the first recommendation around what's called Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So back in 99, it was 1.0. Last year, they released version 2.1. So for nearly 20 years now, there's been internationally accepted guidelines around how to make your web content and your websites accessible. There's 4 principles, a handful of guidelines, and a ton of testable success criteria that help you to ensure that what you're building or what you have released in market is going to work for the broadest possible audience. You'll often see these guidelines grouped into 3 different levels: A, AA, and AAA, and really it's levels of conformance. Generally speaking, at level A, if you tick all of those boxes, you've removed any actual barrier for somebody to use your application. At AA, you've removed the barriers that make it difficult to use your application. And then for certain types of application, for persons with certain types of disabilities, there's some success criteria that are AAA. We maybe don't aim for those all the time, but there's certain scenarios in which we might recommend looking at one or more of the AAA success criteria. So really just quickly, I'll give an overview of what those principles are. The first principle is perceivable. It means that people can perceive the information on the page. So this might mean ensuring that the audio comes with a transcript. The second is operable. It means that people can operate the information on your site. That means that if I'm using a screen reader and your menu system's collapsed by default, that I'm going to be able to navigate to and interact with the menu button, that the menu is going to be able to expand for me and I'm going to be able to navigate through it. Understandable really just means that the content, the user interface for your application is understandable. It means that you're using simple language, clear writing, heading structure to organize the content effectively. And then finally, robust, and this becomes a little bit more of a technical principle, just making sure that you're using web technologies in such a way that they're going to work effectively on a wide variety of devices and a wide variety of browsers. So kind of think about, does it work on Chrome? Does it work on Firefox? Does it work on older versions? Does it work on mobile? Does it work with screen readers? So I hope that gave a fairly good overview about what web accessibility is and who it's important to and why it's important. But what does that mean for your business? The first thing it means for your business, if your website is accessible, and sadly, this is one of the areas where if your website is accessible, you're likely not to hear anybody praise you. But if your website's not accessible, you're likely to hear people complain. The first thing is it's the right thing to do. We want to make sure that if we go back and we consider that there's 15% of the people who are interacting with our brands have a disability of some form, we want to make sure we're doing the right thing, that we're building interfaces and that we're building applications that are going to be easy for them to use, that they're going to enjoy using, just like everybody else. The second thing is it actually does broaden the reach of your brand. Anecdotal, and certainly it's information only coming from myself, but I'll tell you that if I'm searching for something online and I come across a company whose website is, inaccessible to me, if it's impossible or very hard for me to use it, the very first thought that goes to my head is, what other company can I go and get this product or service from? So you really are limiting the reach of your brand. Maybe correlated with that a little bit is the fact that, generally speaking, good accessibility, following those web content accessibility guidelines, it's not just good for accessibility. Often the very same success criteria help to ensure that your website is highly searchable by Google and other search indexers. And finally, and I try to go with this last because although it's very important to some, I certainly don't want to lead with it. There is a growing threat, certainly in the United States, if not North America more broadly, around litigation. And there's been, we'll talk about in a moment, a number of cases where, complainants have raised complaints and been successful, when running into accessibility barriers. So there's a few regulations that I want to just touch on, and there's plenty more in the world, but these are the three that are most relevant for the work that we do. And regulations are a little bit different than guidelines. So if we think back to those web content accessibility guidelines, that's an international standard put together by a group of experts, really recommending the right way to build an application to ensure that it's accessible. Regulations are more around governments creating a set of rules or industry creating a set of rules that says, here's what you need to do to be conformant. So in America, in the United States, there's Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's generally more for vendors to the US government and applications that they procure. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act that we'll touch on briefly. And then in Ontario, specifically up here in Canada, there's the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. That's a somewhat newer piece of legislation, but it ensures to make sure that all communication technology for businesses and governments and not-for-profit are accessible. So I mentioned the accessibility for the Accessibility for Americans with Disabilities Act. And there's an organization, there's a quick quote up here, but really 2017 to 2018, there's been a 181% increase in suits filed under the ADA around accessibility. So this is a growing area of litigation. And, if you're thinking to yourself, wow, nobody in my industry has been litigated against, growing, that the ability to say that is shrinking as more and more complaints are being raised against more and more industries. From a legal standpoint, and certainly I'm not a lawyer and don't want to give legal advice, there's a little bit of uncertainty. If you look through the Americans with Disability Act, you aren't going to see the word website. You're not going to see an explicit regulation that says your website needs to be accessible. But more and more courts throughout America have been allowing complainants to bring these complaints. And even very recently, within the last month, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal has said, yes, that web accessibility is something covered underneath the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's worth keeping in mind as a growing number of sectors and organizations are facing litigation. Is there something that you as an organization could be doing to get out in front of that? So I want to talk a little bit about as I said earlier, one of the areas that we sometimes see resistance is around design. I'm going to have to change my color palette. I'm going to have to change the type of interactive components I use, the patterns. There can sometimes be a little bit of fear. And I certainly don't want to say that designers don't love accessibility. I work with designers every day who take deep pride in ensuring that the user experiences that they build and design are fully accessible and that they've been thinking about it from the very beginning. But as we work with some customers and as I've kind of been out in the community speaking with people, certainly there can be some resistance around design and accessibility. And really, I think design and user experience design is about simplicity and elegance. There's a great quote, up on the slide there. And really what I'd like to argue is that great user experience design, by necessity, has to incorporate accessibility. If what we're saying user experience design means, or great user experience design, is ensuring a simple and elegant experience for all of the people who interact with my brand, then taking accessibility into consideration from the beginning is an imperative. When we take a look at accessibility, when we're designing a project from the very beginning, we sort of have very similar to maybe many other organizations, a staged approach to how we do our work. We like to incorporate from the very beginning the notion of ensuring that what we're designing and what we're delivering is going to be accessible. So up front, we do some discovery. We talk to users, we talk to business stakeholders. We're trying to figure out what the product that we're building needs to do, what the business needs out of it. We're trying to figure out who the users are, who are those key personas, and what do they need out of the product. And at this phase of a project, and it's something that I think really is worth thinking about up front, we're trying to figure out where can we recruit users from those different personas, but particularly making sure that we have users maybe who have different types of abilities and disabilities who are going to be able to help us ensure that what we craft for our customer is a truly universally accessible experience. During the definition phase of our project process, this is where we're really taking everything we've learned and putting it together to solve that hardest challenge first. We're not trying to do things in a staged waterfall way, but we're trying to reduce some of the risk up front and ensure stakeholder alignment. So one of the things we want to do during the design phase is review our prototype that we've come up with. We want to make it sure that it works for all personas, and we want to make sure that it works for people with disabilities. We want to incorporate users early into that. So expert design or expert review is certainly very helpful, but we also want to make sure that we're incorporating users with different types of disabilities in evaluating that prototype so that they can give us feedback about what works well for them and where they might have a challenge. Finally, we start to do some design and development. We start to roll through sprints or iterations to get the product out the door. And during that process, we are going to make sure that we are designing and building that user interface incrementally. We're going to make sure that we're testing with different browsers and devices and assistive technology, screen readers, magnifiers. And we're going to be incorporating users early and often into testing what we've actually built. And then finally, we get into an analyze phase. We've got the product, it's out the door, it's in the market. We want to answer the question, what's working well and what can be improved? We believe that launching a product to market is the very beginning of a journey. It's not where the journey ends. Once we get the product into the market, we want to evaluate quantitatively and qualitatively how that product's working for the business and how that product's working for users. And then we want to take that feedback, put it together into some insights, and ensure that we can put together a bit of a improvements roadmap or an optimization roadmap that allows for the products that we ship to improve in value or increase in value the longer that they're in market. And that means ensuring that as changes are made and as feedback is coming in and as we're requesting and soliciting feedback from different types of users and users with different types of disabilities, that we're incorporating that into the process of optimizing and improving the product. So there's a few ways we've talked really up to this point around how technology is used primarily today, web applications, web content. And, you're thinking about your CMS or maybe your headless CMS. But we want to be looking into the future. We want to be asking ourselves as well, not just how can we make sure that the technology and the user experiences of today are accessible for persons with disabilities, but what does the future look like? How can we make sure that emerging interfaces and emerging technologies are accessible to persons with disabilities? But moreover, how can we leverage emerging interfaces and technology to make things more accessible, to engage more deeply and more broadly with different groups? There's a few things that I'd like to touch on here and maybe share a few examples. The first example is some work that we've put together with dotCMS, which is I think a wonderful example of how we can use tools like Amazon Alexa and Google Assistant both to create and to consume content from within a dotCMS content repository. So I'm going to cue up a video here.
The employee is sitting at his desk typing on a laptop. An email notification appears on his screen. He uses a keyboard shortcut to open his email and start a screen reader.
Can you please add next week's music jam session to the website calendar?
Let's update a website calendar with your voice.
Alexa, ask dotCMS to add an event.
On which date?
November 9th, 2018.
At which time?
In the evening at 6:15.
What is the event called?
Music jam session.
Now access those calendar events from any device. A female is standing on a sidewalk with a white cane and a cell phone in her hand.
Okay, Google, what events are happening tonight?
At 6:15 p.m. there's a music jam session located at the community center. Can I send directions to your phone?
Yes.
Changing how we work at work.
So as you can see, we're using Alexa in this example to create some event content in dotCMS, and really that conversational interface is allowing the user to create the event, and the event is going to be validated and stored in dotCMS. On the flip side, one of the constituents of the organization, maybe it's a customer or an employee, is going to consume information about that event and have it sent to them directly using Google Assistant. So it's really taking a look at extending how that content is being used today. We've got a ton of information about your business already sitting inside of dotCMS. And really what we're talking about here is using some of these emerging interfaces to make that even more accessible, both to your consumers who have disabilities and really to your entire consumer base altogether. Another interesting example of the use of some of these emerging technologies and interfaces is to allow some simplified access to content. So Google Go is a great product that uses some artificial intelligence to synthesize content and then uses text-to-speech to read that content to you. So whether or not you're on the go and really just trying to get the nuggets of content while you're commuting, or maybe you're somebody who has difficulty processing large chunks of text and are really just looking to get the bullet points, the synthesis of it. Or maybe you're trying to process through a ton of content all at once to find trends and themes. Google Go uses a few emerging technologies, both voice and AI synthesis and natural language understanding, in order to condense that content down into something that's easily consumable. And the last project that I want to touch on here, where emerging technologies are being used to make content more accessible, is really something that's just been announced by Microsoft Research, where they're looking at using some research, a team out of the University of Austin, to help improve auto captioning of images. So, if you're not somebody who uses a screen reader, you might be familiar with putting alternative text on an image when you add it into your content. You might not always know exactly what the benefit is. Surely there's an SEO benefit, but it helps people like myself to be able to understand what the image is. If you put an image in your article and you put the right alternative text on it, I'm going to have the same access to the meaning and the purpose of that image as somebody who can see it. But we don't always have time to put captions on images. Not everybody knows how to put them on. And for some sites, social media sites, where there's just these millions and millions of images being uploaded all of the time, it's really difficult for somebody who can't see the image to understand what exact content is in the image. Sites like Facebook have already started to automatically caption images. So, you'll notice if you take a look, you might see an image that says 2 adults and a dog standing in the field. Now, that's great, and certainly having access to that level of information is far better than having no access at all. What Microsoft is working on is a research project where they can go past 2 adults and a dog standing in the field and really start to add some rich meaning and rich content around what exactly is in the image. So I just wanted to take a moment here to share a few ways that emerging technology and emerging interfaces are being used today and are going to be used in the future to help your content become more accessible and reach a broader audience. I know that that's a lot to consume. We touched on what accessibility is, and who it impacts, how it impacts your business, where it intersects with user experience design, and probably where some of the objections that you might hear are perhaps not completely valid, where good design and good accessibility can go hand in hand. And we've taken a look at the state of the future and how these new technologies can be used to reach a broader audience. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and I'd love to take the time that we have left today to answer as many of them as we can. So I'll hand it back over to Stefan, and he can help lead the Q&A.
Sure. Thanks, Everett. This was great. Yeah, let's take some questions here. Here's one for you, Everett. It's really interesting that Google Assistant can be used to access content from an existing website. What if we have more than one event? How hard is it to make all of our content accessible using Google?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, taking a look at the example that we demonstrated here, we were looking really at one specific type of content, events, But what if you had events and news and blog articles and products and solutions and a variety of content like most marketing sites do today? Really, you need to take a step back there and look at, and this goes outside of accessibility specifically, but a broader conversational design strategy. How is your voice channel and your other channels where your customers are interacting with the brand, how are they working together and complementing each other? So there's a few different things. Both Google Assistant and Alexa support flash briefings, so that's an interesting opportunity if you are posting kind of branded news or perhaps some briefer blog type content on a regular basis. You can kind of push that out and have people subscribe to that on their different devices. Broader than that, we kind of see that people are building up maybe less of a how do I navigate the entire website using my voice, though maybe that comes sometime in the future, and more of a, is there something that's unique about my brand? Where's our UVP, and how can we build a skill or an action on Google around that specific brand presence? So whether it's something around wellness, if you're in the healthcare sector, maybe it's something around accessing information at your fingertips if you're a service provider. What's the unique value that you can bring to your users, something they might do while they're cooking dinner or sitting in the living room when they wake up in the morning, or just before they go to bed. That's where these devices are generally positioned in someone's home. Is there a user touch point or a customer touch point where you think you can bring your specific knowledge and content to the user in that context?
Great. Well, we definitely have a fan on the line for you, Everett. So question for Everett. You're truly an expert speaker, and your presentation of this material is so smooth that I forget that you don't see the same slides that I do on my screen in this webinar. I know you personally, so I have a picture of you in mind right now presenting with this slide deck. Maybe you've memorized a sequence of slides. Maybe you have Brian notes with you. My point, and then my point, and then my question is that you've achieved such skill as presenter, as speaker, by developing your own ways to manipulate technology, and you've devised complementary tools and techniques such as your own memory, your voice recognition. Can you give us a sense to what extent other people with unique abilities have become as adept as you? For example, the Pareto principle informs us that very few people become so adept. Most people in the distribution achieve average competences, and a non-trivial portion of the population really struggle against these accessibility barriers. I suspect that you are in the top percentile of the Pareto distribution, or would you describe your use of technology as normal? Wow.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me try to put. I think that this goes way outside of technology, though I think the question kind of starts there, and I think it really starts with a lot of socioeconomic factors. Depending on the statistic you look at, anywhere between 70 and 80% of, using blindness as an example, 70 to 80% of blind North Americans are unemployed. It's not that they're not employable. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Number one is huge bias, obviously, in the labor market. How could a person who's blind do X? The second factor, obviously, that goes into it is, there are some jobs that would certainly be much more difficult to accommodate somebody who's blind. And so when you're struggling, even to find employment, when you're struggling through the education system, as many persons with disabilities do, you don't build up some of those core competencies, or it can be a more difficult time building up some of the core competencies required to be effective in the workplace. So I really think that, taking myself out of the equation, if you are set up for success, if you are able to access education, if the institution where you're doing your education does provide accommodation, if you find employers where they're very similar to Myplanet, where it's open arms, and of course we're going to make the accommodations required, I think that a lot of the barriers is less about, yes, there's technology struggles and you've got to work around things, and not every piece of technology is accessible, but I think there's a large socioeconomic aspect around the bias in society, and just around, how you set yourself up with the first steps around education and those first few employment opportunities that help you to build the skills to be able to be successful later on.
Yeah, that's a mouthful. What really resonates with me, I don't know about you guys, but it's just the numbers, like the 23 billion that people with disabilities can add to the economy, as well as the disposable income of 8 trillion. That's just mind blowing to me. Another question that I have, and I think I'd like you to answer that one as well from your perspective, Everett, is, okay, so how about accessibility and headless deployments of content management systems, right? Where you want to basically, manage applications in, frameworks like Angular, React, and what have you, or even, feed content to IoT devices, right? That's a great question, because headless is super trending right now in our space. The way that I see it is that, CMS to me is just, content repository or content foundation, how we articulate it, that allows you to manage touch points, right? And we honestly couldn't care about how that touch point looks like. It could be a screen, but if there's no screen, yeah, you obviously have, voice activated devices, like Alexa, Google Assistant, and what have you. So from a pure CMS perspective, I don't see any restrictions when it comes to digital accessibility and exposing content in whatever form to your audiences, right? Including people with disabilities. What's your take on that one, Everett?
No, I would tend to agree with you correctly. And the nice part about headless is you really have full control. Whoever's doing the implementation of, let's call it the head, whoever's building and designing the head has full control over what that experience is like. So if it's an experience with, whether it's Alexa or Google Assistant, if it's maybe a bit of a more of a multimodal experience, if you think of, say, the Alexa Show or, the Google Home Hub. We don't have the Home Hub in Canada yet. We have to sneak down into the US to bring one back. But if you think about those experiences where you now have voice along with a visual display, if you think about doing something like a mobile app, a native app on Android or iOS or web, or something honestly that takes your content and tweets it out or posts it for you to LinkedIn, there's so many different interfaces and different touch points along the customer journey now that can be integrated through one cohesive content repository. It's really about where is the accessibility of those devices, and maybe to the point, the one area that you need to be considerate about when you do headless is, are we indeed investing thoughtfully at the beginning to the design, kind of as we walked through that process there? Are you thinking about accessibility from the very beginning of that discovery and definition? If you're thinking about doing something multimodal on the Google Home Hub, have you considered, are my users going to need to be able to interact with the visual display, or is that supplementary content? Are they going to need to be able to tap what the visual display? And if they are, what if it's a user who really has a hard time tapping the display? What are you going to provide for them? Will you give them a voice interface as an alternative to interacting with the visual display? So I think that certainly headless actually helps us a great deal to be able to syndicate the content, not just through one channel, but through multiple channels. But in so doing, we've got to be thoughtful about, for each one of those channels, are we ensuring that persons with disabilities are going to be able to interact to the fullest?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Now, a great example about Alexa skills with the CMS is the case study that we have with Gettysburg College. Great use case that definitely includes digital accessibility. I think we're almost, at the end of the webinar. Just want to go through some of the questions that we still have here. You talked about accessibility and design working together. In my organization, I've experienced pushbacks from design about, accessibility issues. do you have any recommendations about how to effectively engage designers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I certainly don't get pushback within our organization, but we have received pushback in the past, maybe from customers or others. So it's a great question. I mean, step one, anytime you're facing an objection, and you got to figure out what's the source. You know, is it the designer's not really interested in having anybody meddle at all in the design? Is that just, you know, this is my design, I own this space? There might be a different approach there. Is it an awareness issue? Is it I really don't understand what you're asking for, but I know it's going to create more work? Is it an empathy issue? You know, I'm designing the way I think I need to. Maybe it's just an education and an empathy issue. So the first thing I'd want to do is listen. You know, maybe set it as an imperative. This does need to be accessible to persons with disabilities. That's going to be a constraint on the project. We don't think it's going to really impact the ability to create great design, but we want to hear from you, Mr. or Mrs. Designer. Help us understand what are you concerned about? What are your worries? Is it about the fact that you think you'll need more time? You know, then we'll help you with providing more time. Is it about the fact that you don't have access to understanding what it would take to make sure that what you're designing is accessible? Fine, we'll get you access maybe to an expert, maybe to some resources to help you understand. So, you know, I think that faced with the question of can you make your design more appealing to a broad audience of users, you're not going to come across many designers who say that's a terrible idea, but you might come across designers who have pressures, you know, time or otherwise, resources, where they say that's not possible. And I think there's got to be some empathy for them as well, and just setting them up to be successful.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, I think it's a matter of time also, right? I mean, as you know, lawsuits increase, again, it's a little bit like the GDPR. You know, it's just, you know, you got to comply. And like I said, I think the key drivers are really the 8 trillion, in my opinion. So great answer. One question before we wrap it up. Yeah, so do you have any recommendations on how to limit our liability? Well, first of all, I think you should go back to your foundation, the CMS. That's one piece. Obviously, dotCMS would be your go-to vendor. But yeah, I think, Everett, there's more to it, right? I mean, just the CMS is not going to cut it.
Well, exactly. And, you know, let me preface by saying I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. I think that there's probably a great deal of empathy when, number one, when a consumer reaches out, there's got to be a channel for them to be able to reach somebody who can make a change. You know, if they reach frontline service workers, if they reach somebody in a contact center, if the questions and concerns around accessibility go unnoticed, obviously that's not going to be effective. That's not legally increasing your liability. That's just probably increasing the likelihood that somebody complains through a different channel than directly. So I think there needs to be a real clear pathway for consumers to raise their concerns and let you know about the limitations that are being faced. And the person that's receiving those needs to be empowered from within your organization to actually act on the complaint and make change. The second thing that I'd say is, you know, there's nothing stopping you from starting right this moment at gaining a better understanding of the accessibility of your digital product, taking a look at it, assessing it where you are, and then maybe just, you know, let's not pretend that we can snap our fingers and make everything go away. That's not how the world works. But maybe creating a roadmap through 2019 of how you're going to get from where you are today to a more accessible product. Maybe if you've got an internal development team, you know, pull in 1 or 2 tickets a sprint over the course of the year. If accessibility is an imperative to you, if it's a serious concern, and it should be, maybe, you know, pull in a group of experts who can assist with accelerating that roadmap. But I really do think that in advance of resolving whatever barriers might exist in your current digital product, the first step has to be ensuring that persons with disabilities who have concerns where your brand or your digital product are creating barriers, they have to have easy access to report that, and somebody who's empathetic and can take action has to receive the message.
Great. Thanks a lot, Everett. Yeah, let's wrap up the call. Again, thanks everybody for joining. I hope this was useful for everybody. Thank you, Everett, for your insights and sharing those. It's always great listening to you. As mentioned by Alex, this webinar is recorded, so you guys will get a recording in the email afterwards. Again, thanks a lot. Thanks for joining, and we'll hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.